you agree we have 7? It's going to record for us. So here we are. Good evening, everyone. I just want to take a breath and center myself a little bit. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, and I just want to welcome everyone tonight. I want to apologize again for the late attachment of the agenda to the meeting invite. It was posted. And I just want to thank everyone in advance for their grace and generosity as we move through this agenda tonight with a lot of work ahead of us. So we thought what we do tonight that's a little different than what we have done other weeks is instead of everyone going around and introducing themselves with a quick check-in, we would invite everyone because although that is really lovely, we also have a lot to do in our meetings together, and we are getting to know each other well. So I just want to invite folks to use the chat box if they can to introduce themselves, to say good evening, and I would invite you as part of that if you wanted to share a gratitude, which I always find is a lovely practice. You can use the chat box to introduce yourself. If you're a subcommittee member, if you're a guest, we invite all of you to introduce yourselves in the chat box, if you will. It's good to know who's in the room with us and to share a gratitude. So if folks just want to take a moment to take a breath and do that, I think that would be really wonderful. I recognize it takes a moment to keep and pause and just do that, though. That will be really great if folks can use the chat box. Whether you're a guest or a subcommittee member, lots of wonderful gratitudes. Great. So while folks are doing that, I'm just going to keep us moving along in our agenda. Maybe later at the end of the meeting, people can reflect if they like that approach or want to go back to our old check-in approach. But so the next thing that we want to do is review and approve both the agenda and the minutes. I believe that the 429 minutes we did, the minutes from April 29th that we actually did approve at the last meeting, but maybe there was some confusion if we did, so we can just accept those by consent unless there was something that folks wanted to discuss from those. And then again, I want to apologize that the meeting minutes from last week actually were posted late. They weren't posted until, I believe, maybe this morning, and so, or today, and so we can postpone that to next week. And then I think importantly, we need to review our agenda and move forward with the agenda. So today we actually invited Judy Dow, who is a subcommittee member from Ag and Ecosystems, to provide a community listen session for us and just share a little bit about what community she's trying to represent in this process and share a little bit about what she's actually shared with the Ag and Ecosystems subcommittee. There was a meeting of the co-chairs earlier for all the subcommittees earlier this week. We thought it'd be important to share some big takeaways from that. And then we wanted to spend some time finalizing our draft principles, coming back to the conversation around impacted communities, pause for public comment. We had thought about spending the bulk of our time together in this meeting digging back into these questions for other subcommittees. So how do we take our just transitions principles, that draft principles, and turn those into questions that subcommittees can use to assess and evaluate the proposals they're putting forward. And then at the end, we'll just do a little bit of business where we check in about what's happening in other subcommittees. And is there anything that I have, any questions about that agenda, anything else that we should be adding in? Okay, great. We'll move forward then. I just realized that I have this wonderful intention to begin the meeting with a land acknowledgement, which I did not do. And I had hoped, Kaya shared last week a land acknowledgement that she presented during her community listen session that folks remember, and I had hoped to use that and to incorporate at the start of our meetings. I just want to try and honor that intention, although I don't have Kaya's beautifully written out words in front of me to read as a land acknowledgement, but I want to just put forward that intention that I think that would be a great way for us to start our meetings, just to recognize that the land that we're sitting on here in Vermont is of the Abenaki people. So I'll work on bringing that back to our future meetings, or if folks have other examples of language that's been used in meetings, I think that would be helpful. Sorry, I skipped over that part. It's new for us, and so I think that's why I missed it, but that was the intention. But with that, I think I'll tee it up. I'll tee it up for Judy. So Judy, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight and making time. Judy has, I'm not sure, I think it went out to the whole subcommittee members, but if not to some of us anyway, the co-chairs, something that you presented to the subcommittee that you're a part of, and we just thought it'd be great to bring your voice in that conversation into our work here at the Just Transition Committee as well. So I don't know that I want to provide more or maybe I'll just hand it over to you, Judy. How's that? And you can sort of introduce that more. But I'm just really grateful that you made time for us today. Thank you.
Thank you. I have 2 slides. Is it possible to somehow share so we can see them?
Judy, do you have them open on your computer?
I do. So just hit.
So, yeah, share. Yeah, there you go. You did it, Judy. I know you hate technology. Nice job.
Yeah, so let me make it, which one is it? This one? This one's full screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there you go. So I am a Abenaki, and I presented a Native direction to looking at the climate change scenario, mostly because I began to see all the people in the committee were coming from silos. They were coming from a specific area of which they had expertise. And for thousands and tens of thousands of years, Indigenous people had the same philosophy, and it worked. Silos did not work, and silos will not work. And it's kind of like looking at if every animal and fish from the ocean was gone today, the world would stop functioning as we know it. However, if the humans were gone tomorrow, the world would flourish. And so we have to look at it differently. And so in most charts like this, we would have family or people or home in the center, something like that. And then we would grow out from there to like neighborhoods and communities and state and country and so on and so forth. And somewhere in here would enter the economy, something about economy. For the Native people, a key, the soil is the center of everything. The soil is the birthing place. It's where all things begin and all things end. And the spine of the land is the community. It's the microorganisms all the way to humans. And the role of the spine of the community is to care for a key or to care for the soil. And then the next layer out is the banned land or the watershed. And to care for the watershed is critical. The headwaters of the watershed, the tributaries of the watershed feed the spine of the land, which in turn feeds the soil. And so those three concentric circles are imperative for a healthy world. And then you start going out, you get the nation's land where everybody speaks the same language, and you get Gedakana, our worldview or our world. And somewhere out in that area is where economy should be. It should not be in the center. And so what I propose to the ag and ecosystem is every statement they look at, put the health of the soil and the health of the water first. And once you accomplish that, then you can move on to economics. Because it's like a child, when you send a child to school, you don't send them sick, but you heal the child and then you send them to school. It's the same thing. You can't expect to have an economy off the soil if it's sick, or off the water if it's sick. And so in my classes, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but I teach elementary school. And these are the 4 questions I use with my students. And I figured if they were good enough for the students, they were good enough for us to use. And so, does the practice support reducing energy use? Does the practice contribute to lessening man-made waste? Is it somehow helpful to the environment? And those 3 you find often in textbooks. The last one is different. The last one is an indigenous way of looking at land. Is there fairness to all living things, human and non-human? And that human and non-human point refers to soil and water. Because soil and water are alive, they're animate in our language. And so they should have the same fairness as all and be considered a living thing. So this is the 2 proposals I submitted to the ag people, and Jane was there and she thought perhaps I should share it with others. So do you have any questions?
Tasha, yes.
I just wanted to comment on this and just say how I appreciate just bringing this into the conversation and just talking about this. I feel like we do things backwards, and I think that the indigenous people are trying to teach us to look at things with a different perspective. And it just makes me think so much of even such things in Vermont as bringing in the F-35s and how that affects not just, humans, but all of the animals that are affected by the sonic boom. And anyway, I just wanted to share that. So I'm just really grateful for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so ingrained in us I can remember saying to my children, whoever told you life was fair? Life as we know it today is not fair. We have to work hard to make life fair. And people don't want to work that hard. They don't want that same fairness to every living thing. And that's the struggle we have in making a healthy soil and a healthy water. It's a struggle for everybody.
Yes, and then we see the results of the imbalance and everything.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think my hope is that this could be considered as part of your guiding principles.
Nadia, you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much, Judy, for these fantastic insights. One thing that we struggle with as a subcommittee, and I've seen this in other subcommittees as well, is just the meaning of specific words. So for us, we're digesting equity and justice, and for your reference to fairness, to make sure that we're really understanding and putting that into practice, how would your presentation define fairness, and what does it mean to be fair to all living things?
Equity. And when I work with children, I define equity as 3 children having a pair of sneakers. The first one has shoestrings. The second one has the sole flapping in the breeze. And the third one has no shoestrings. And they're all equal, but there's no equity there when they don't have the same shoes, sneakers. And again, I don't mean to talk down to you, but when you're dealing with 3rd and 4th graders, you have to be able to present it that way to them.
Thanks, Judy. I'll just say I don't think that's talking down at all. I think we should all stand to use language in a way that feels accessible. It's a point of practice for myself, so thank you for that.
We talk about that. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
We talk about that in our group a lot because we don't have the same definitions often. And some of them relate to the difference between resilient and adaptation. Some of them are like that far apart in definitions, and some of them are this far apart. And so it seems like we seem to spend a lot of time on defining things. So I can understand where you're coming from.
David.
Hi, thanks. And thanks, Judy. I think one of the things that's I think would feel new for this subcommittee is when we're talking about fairness, which you equated to equity, which makes a lot of sense for this subcommittee, is when you add in all living creatures, right? Because this group's been thinking about communities and communities that historically have suffered oppression or racism or otherwise been vulnerable. And to add in this other element of, oh, and by the way, we're thinking about non-human communities as well. That's a step beyond what this subcommittee's done so far. And it's very interesting to contemplate what that means for this subcommittee. Well, I'm not sure where everyone wants to go with that.
I could probably give you 101 stories related to that, but since everything I do is story related, I'll give you one. I got a call one time from UVM Environmental Science Department. They were trying to reach my husband who has a Boy Scout troop. And they said to him, we'd like the Boy Scouts to go into the interval and pick all the heads off the purple loosestrifes so they don't go to seed. And I'm like, lady, you called the wrong number with that request. And she said, why? And I said, well, let me put it this way. How would you feel if we popped the heads off every pilgrim that came to this country? And she's hung up. But that's the point. We're all equal. And to make equality between all of us, we have to be treated the same. And when I first started, I gave you that scenario of if all the life in the ocean died, we would stop operating the way we do today. Everything in this world would stop. But if the humans all died today, the land would flourish. And because the impacts the humans have on all living things is what's causing this trauma that Mother Earth is experiencing now. I don't know if that helps you or not, and it's hard to think of the world as being equal.
I think it's going to be when we look at principles and later this in this meeting, it will be interesting to put that lens on those principles.
It will be difficult.
Right.
Because you've never put yourself in the same category as a worm or something like that. But then when you think of the role the worm plays in the earth, you understand the importance of that worm, which is sometimes more important than a human. There's a lot of literature out there, the Bureau of Land Management and a lot of the scientists involved in land management and seed saving and that types of things. They keep putting out articles and books in regards to we have to start doing this or we're never going to get out of this mess. We have to seriously start looking at it. It's been 400 years of silos and it didn't work. So we have to go back to the way things were if we're going to make a difference.
Jane, you have your hand up.
Judy, this is a little bit off topic, but because the two examples that you've given around purple loosestrife and then earthworms, I was thinking of. I'm just kind of curious, and maybe this is a conversation in ag and ecosystems to put a pin in on what TEK and traditional ecological knowledge says about invasive species.
Oh yeah, that's a 2-week lesson.
Okay.
Okay. So you're looking for equality, or a lot of this country is looking for equality around race right now, right? It's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
When you look, there should be equality around all the plants here. We were given 7 prophecies, sometimes called 7 fires. And in the 7th fire, we were going to enter into a fork in the road, and one path would lead to a lush green path and the other one would lead to destruction. And many others believe unless we come together as one and go down the lush path, we'll totally destroy ourselves. And so when you think of when the glacier started to recede some 14,000 years ago, there wasn't even a fraction of an inch of topsoil here. So everything here now was introduced. And where would we have been if we called everything here invasive?
You're giving us a lot to chew on. Thank you. I really value that, introducing some new lines of thinking into our process.
Yeah, I've been struggling a lot with that in our committee because it's a concept so foreign to everybody. But it's one that has to be considered seriously.
I wonder if folks have other questions or examples, if we want to be vulnerable and talk. We have a few more minutes on our agenda for this topic to just kind of talk through some of those. I'm thinking about how it's come up in our subcommittee, for instance, how much renewable energy relies on battery power and what that means in lithium batteries and sort of the thinking sort of, the down the line, we may be doing that here in the battery production elsewhere and what that's doing to the land and the soil and just kind of having a broader understanding around those impacts. It's interesting for me to bring this framework into thinking about that. I wonder if others have other examples or other questions of things that are coming to mind. How they could see this changing some of our approach around our principles. Yeah, Chris.
And one of the issues, I forget who I was talking about this with, that's come up a good bit, is I know when I was working on my first master's and I was working with shrimp fishermen, part of what I found out in my research was and it just kind of opened my eyes that, like, as they would design more fuel efficient trawls in order to save diesel, what the shrimpers would do typically, and this is not unique to them, but it's just, you know, some of the first research that opened my eyes was it allowed them to pull faster and harder because the trawls would allow them to pull faster and harder. They basically pull up to that point where they lost the diesel savings. So basically, they were still breaking even, right? And what I've just learned over, you know, life in general is we tend to, you know, like you get LED light bulbs. What does that mean? We can turn the light, you can burn more light bulbs to kind of get it back to the point where you were before, as opposed to just using less artificial light generally. And so, you know, you have a more efficient air conditioner, that means you can run it colder. And even if you look at electric cars, right? I mean, I know part of it's marketability, but a lot of what's come out is that they're marketed on speed and power. You know, now we're going to have the electric Hummer. You've got Teslas with ludicrous speed. And I think one of our big challenges with you know, converting to electricity is this temptation that we have, I think, as a species, generally as a species, to just keep consuming more power. When we also, not only do we need to work on switching to electricity, we also need to work on, you know, efficiency and just frankly reducing that power consumption anyway, because then you have to have more lithium batteries. You have to have more of this, more of that. And it's still going to put, you know, the privileged classes at a greater advantage to the unprivileged classes, right? It's still going to continue those inequities. And that to me is a big challenge that we're going to face, you know, as a global society, trying to resist this temptation to make this conversion, but not change anything else about how we conduct ourselves in our lives. And I think that's going to be the challenge, not only for, you know, our climate council, but frankly, you know, climate policy, period, you know, getting to what Judy presented, you know, still not, you know, we maybe will reduce our footprint, and, you know, I mean, that's a bad metaphor, but maybe we'll reduce our carbon footprint, you know, in the atmosphere, but we're not necessarily changing the other impacts we have on ecosystems and, you know, all the systems that allow, you know, not just human life, but all life to exist on Earth. So, and I know everybody knows this, but it was just interesting I just remember when I first kind of woke up to that human behavior when I was doing that research, you know, years ago. The research I was doing was use of sea turtle protection devices by shrimpers to try to reduce the impacts on turtles. And the reason why the trawl issue came into effect was because they're trawling faster and harder, they were catching more turtles. So anyway, that's it.
So what that brings up for me is two things. Would that be considered resilient, or would that be considered adapting? Because in one case you want to save, but they adapt to stay where they were. And then the next question it brings up for me is, do they understand the difference between a want and a need? Do they need that many shrimp? Or do they want that many shrimp? And I think we have to spend some time addressing the difference between a want and a need, because people don't understand anymore. What they necessarily need is not the same as what they want. I mean, you're talking to a person who lives in Essex, and once a month, at least, we lose our power from anything from a day to 15 days. And so I've learned to cook on a hubcap in the middle of my driveway because I need to eat, and I don't have to have electricity to do that. I can just make a fire on a hubcap and cook my meal in a Dutch oven, which I do sometimes weeks at a time. And my children, when they were growing up, thought we were playing a game. And so when we get the power back on, they'd say, "Ma, can we play We Have No Power again?" Because they used to like the things that we did to adapt and survive.
Thanks, Judy, for sharing that. And thanks, Chris. I think
Yeah.
you helped kind of advance some of this thinking. And then I see there's some great comments in the comment box as well, I think from Lauren, and just these questions I think are really helpful for us to think about adding. Other comments or questions for Judy before we move along? Yes, Kashka.
It just made me think about, and Judy kind of cut out there for a second for me. I don't think my internet's super stable, but it just made me think back to the beginning of 2020 when everything stopped, and how the world was quickly coming back together. So it's not save the earth, it's save the humans. Because the earth was adapting quickly to us not being so excessively engaged in consumption of everything. And so it just, what Judy was saying and Chris as well made me think
And I think we lost Kashka. Back. I'll come back to her, but
versus the meat.
Thanks, Kashka. You cut out a little bit there, and at the end, I heard you coming back to this piece around a want versus a need, and that was really sounding for you. So, and just want to, I think I'm going to keep moving us along for the sake of our agenda. But Judy, I just want to say thank you. I think that actually was so perfectly timed with our conversation today to bring those questions and that perspective into this work. So I'm really glad that you could make time for us, and hope if you're able to stick around as we continue to do our work together today, I think that would be most welcome.
Thank you.
And just want to encourage folks, if you look at the chat box, there's great comments and thinking about how we start to incorporate some of these ideas into our principles. So with that, I think, Nadia, you were going to maybe do some big takeaways from the co-chairs meeting earlier this week so that we could, everyone could be up to speed on that. So I'll turn it to you.
Great, thank you. As Sarah mentioned, this Monday, the steering committee convened the co-chairs from each of the subcommittees to provide a high-level update on recent activity, as well as any roadblocks that they might be facing. And overall, the subcommittees remain committed to the goal of delivering their respective drafts by this July, and much to our delight, express their support, prioritization, and eagerness for pending deliverables, specifically from Just Transitions. And for us, this is, of course, great to hear, because it means that the subcommittees continue to take our work very seriously and very mindfully as they move forward. At a high level for Just Transitions, we provided an update on the significant progress that we've made in drafting our principles, identifying impacted communities, and developing the questions that subcommittees can use to better understand and implement each of the guiding principles. Here, Sue highlighted that we aim to have these for the other subcommittees in the coming week or so, and Chris wisely added that they remain in draft format and that we welcome feedback and questions from the other subcommittees accordingly. For cross-sector mitigation, the subcommittee has divided their work into industry-specific areas within the emissions profiles, which I believe are helpful for our subcommittee to know and understand. These include electricity, transportation, building decarb, and then finally agriculture and non-energy, which would include, for instance, the industrial sectors. This is helpful for Just Transitions as we determine how best to craft our principles and assessment tools to support specific industry initiatives and specific proposals as well. They particularly emphasize their eagerness for a public engagement process from our subcommittee, and what additional, perhaps more nuanced and impactful policy options would result from it. And in this, they refer to the chicken or egg problem of either waiting to draft the recommendations until they have a sense of the priorities based on public engagement, or just to dive in, begin drafting, and instead provide priorities for the public to engage upon. For rural resilience, their biggest challenge is defining resilience. The tension that they face is that this issue has been defined within the broader climate action movement, but now they're thinking about what it means for Vermont specifically and how to implement it specifically for Vermonters. The focus areas of their work, again, I believe to be helpful to our work on just transitions, includes transportation, communications, and electrical infrastructure, amongst others. And finally, they are currently working through an inventory and research section to their work plan in order to develop an inventory of programs and policies that can have an impact on rural resilience. And they are working from an existing inventory, which begs the question from just transitions of how we can help other subcommittees evaluate whether or not they're building upon outmoded or perhaps directly or indirectly discriminatory policies and programs. And then lastly, with ag and ecosystems, they continue to focus on agricultural emissions, nature-based solutions, and carbon reduction methodologies. And they were also mindful to mention that their work is pending guidance from our subcommittee on engagement and more broadly based on our Just Transitions draft principles. Sarah, you're on mute.
Sorry. And also Beverly is trying to join us tonight, so I was trying to send her the link. Sorry about that. Thank you, Nadia. What questions do people have for Nadia about the co-chairs meetings or what some of the other subcommittees are doing? Some of you are sitting in on those subcommittees, so you're well aware, but. Okay. So
Sarah, I might just add that there was a sort of robust discussion about the tension between the timeline that's kind of been set before us and the wish that we all had to be able to sort of slow down. And I think I maybe this was just me speaking, but I think there was a sense that people were grateful to consider December a date by which we offer a draft as opposed to a final. I'm not sure where that landed, Jane, but I think that's just an issue that's pretty important that we're all trying to debate or think through. But anyway, just wanted to, every group, it isn't just us, is concerned about the timeline, I think.
Thanks, Lee. I was going to mention that, and I'm trying out this week, not draft, because we don't like draft, but initial comprehensive climate action plan. So I'm trying initial as my test run for the word this week, but that was a common theme, and that's a continued theme. And the other comment I was going to highlight was that just so everybody knows, the public engagement consultants are meeting with all the other subcommittees this week. They've met with cross-sector and science and data now, and tomorrow they'll meet with ag and ecosystems and rural resilience and adaptation. And we're getting a lot of great feedback on a series of questions that they're asking to frame up the initial phase of public engagement around framing the issues. So the audience analysis, the interviews, and the roundtables they'll conduct. And I just wanted to let you know that their intention is to synthesize their feedback from the other subcommittees and then sort of present that final package to you all at my assumption would be next week's meeting, so that they're really testing that with all of you as the main subcommittee managing that work. So that's really great. But I think that's adding to the concern around timeline that certainly feels like it. Just understanding that's going to take some time, and then bringing that synthesized public engagement back to the subcommittees to inform their strategies and recommendations will also take time. So moving forward as we can, and calling it initial plan for now.
Okay. So I'm going to keep us moving forward on our agenda. I'm the taskmaster here tonight. And I'm going to, Jane, I think I need to share my screen next if I'm able to do that. So I think
everybody can share, just so you know.
Wonderful, great. So I want to lay out sort of where we're going, just so people can remember sort of our final sort of deliverable here is, and I think EOEO second might be Virginia. Virginia, is that you? Would you like to say hello?
Yes. Hi. Am I
Hi,
visible? Yes. Hi, I'm sorry for my tardiness.
I think we all have it in our lives, so no apologies. We're so glad you're joining us tonight, and
thank you.
thank you.
Thank
To
you very
welcome
much.
you. Yes, please turn on your camera and join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So just where we're going, right? So we have these draft overarching themes and some description of our principles. We have impacted in frontline communities, some work we're doing on that. We have some questions we're trying to queue up that will help the other subcommittees guide where they're going. All of that is going to come together sort of in a package, and we're working on sort of an introductory summary that kind of pulls it all together as a whole package that we deliver to subcommittees. And we're trying to get there as quickly as we can, but with respect to going at the pace at which we can, right? So we don't want to undermine that effort. So I don't know if my coaches want to add to that, but I just thought that would kind of tee us up here. And so the first thing, and I will share my screen. So we have 3 things on our agenda tonight. We've been working on iterations and different drafts of our principles. Last week, we looked at some revisions. People had additional feedback they wanted to give. People sent me some feedback. People sent some feedback to the whole group. Good reminder that we want to try to avoid that, right? So all of that feedback is being shared as part of this public meeting. So we're coming clean with a couple email exchanges to say that's all here, and also to say that I think we all value when we can see these drafts in advance of the meeting so that we have time to digest them. Some of us need time to do that. So I'm sort of pausing for a moment to say I think I was really challenged this week with different people providing feedback, and then the task of trying to pull that together in a synthesized document, which to get to you all in advance really needed to happen Tuesday, right? So the time between when we end on Thursday and when we need to publish it on Tuesday is very tight. And this is not a fault conversation, because believe me, I'm like as busy as we're all super busy. But I was feeling like I felt a little bit too out on a limb to try. When I went to synthesize these and create sort of a new draft, I was like, I'm kind of doing this by myself. That doesn't feel right. And so what I'm going to share my screen is not sort of the newly revised draft, but instead what I'd like to propose is that 3 or 4 of us, not even, maybe it's just 2 or 3 of us, maybe it's just 2 of us, come together. I just was feeling very alone in this work. Come together and work on then find like a final iteration of this that we bring back to the group. But I want to at least share the feedback with folks briefly now. We haven't built a lot of time into our conversation tonight to talk. So I'm sort of bringing that emotion and feeling to this work. I'm smart enough to share my screen on Zoom. Okay.
I just wanted to also recognize that Beverly is with us. Welcome, Beverly. We love having you here with us.
Wonderful. Thank you. And for some reason, I can't see you guys now while I'm sharing my screen. Okay. So, and thank you, Beverly. I'm so glad you got the Zoom link. Okay. So, we will post this. I will send it out by email to folks, but I just added in sort of this thought around fairness to all living things, human and non-human, and some of Judy's other questions we should think about incorporating. Iris sent some great feedback around adding in this first section where we talk about environmental, climate, and energy justice, that we really aren't using the words racial and economic justice, although it might be implied in there, and we might want to add those. Certainly one of the themes that came up from a couple different people in their comments was wanting to incorporate low income or just the income inequality more explicitly in our just transition principles. So to that end, adding that here. I'm going to review these quickly for folks so you can see all of them. Chris added this language. I think folks saw that just talked about being more explicit about potential impacts, benefits, burdens, and that the importance of that. Chris added a similar statement that I haven't necessarily, I think I added maybe on the side here, but into this section. So whether or not we want it in both sections or we want to be more explicit in one place or the other, I think is something we need to figure out. And then I think, just to say, this was another comment that Chris made about being explicit in identifying those impacts. Again, I think that's been the intention of our work together, and so adding that piece in here. Danielle offered a suggestion around, instead of fair labor, saying strong and equitable labor standards. Sorry, I maybe didn't get her piece exactly right. I can go back and look. I think Nadia offered, and I think this makes sense, that at some level we want to make sure that all recommendations are just part of that work is to name the frontline communities based on that specific recommendation, Nadia, if I understand you correctly. I think there's a couple different language, and Iris, I see, is adding some additional things to the chat box here. But, you know, thinking about, we have this piece here about the most impacted first, you know, adding in separately or as part of that, something that's, we did have something in the original version that talk about shared burden, but something that comes back to this idea around shared burden and shifting the economic burden onto, or just looking at that in terms of the economic burden on low-income folks. And similar to that, but different, is this idea around not placing additional financial burden on people. Nadia suggested that this idea of safety nets is something she had incorporated based on conversations, but really maybe is captured in other sections, and pulling it out separately was maybe confusing. And then I think just generally a comment that we want to try and have more clear language and maybe work on an overview of this that changes some of our language to be more direct, less ambiguous, regardless of who's reading it, right? So that you wouldn't have had to been in all of our conversations as a committee to understand what we're saying here. And to that end, I started to work on that and realized that I didn't want to be doing that work alone. So I'm going to pause there. I can't see people and share my screen. I don't know how to do that in Zoom. But maybe if people raise their hands, I can see them, or maybe somebody else can call on folks if there are comments or thoughts.
Judy's got her hand up. Judy, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm from the very beginning, I'm confused by a lot of this. So I see inequity and I see equities, but you don't really say around what. So using an environmental justice, climate justice, and energy justice lens, why aren't you using an equity lens in there?
Yeah, I think those frameworks incorporate, you know, when you, in the environmental justice, I think, please others step in. I don't feel like I have all the answers here. But I think the thinking is that environmental justice, that term comes with it, like a whole movement and set of principles and understanding that is definitely about equity and justice. And so we've used this term trying to bring all of what that is into this. But in doing that, I think you're right, Judy, we may have lost the fact that like people may not have that understanding of what that means when we use that term.
Well, and I would be clear, because this is going to be a criteria for many perspectives to review. So I might say using an environmental equity justice something. You see what I'm saying? You need the word equity in there. The other question is, where is the traditional ecological knowledge in here?
I want to just mention that, Judy, this is in the middle of a document that has above it more explanation, which I think may help with the where's the equity. But even we have a whole section defining communities. So I'm not positive that will answer your question, but I think it will certainly speak to it. And I think you're looking at what we are doing tonight is trying to sort of finalize these came from everybody's gathering of thoughts together. And I think you're raising really important things that might not be so confusing when you see this in the context of the full document. This is kind of the meat and potatoes. So I just wanted to offer that as well.
Thank you. And I don't mean to be a Monday night quarterback either. But so there was one place where you mentioned equity from several angles. I think that has to be more clear too, because are you talking about the angles between two people, or between people and plants, or people and water? Or I just think there needs to be some clarification there.
Thanks, Judy. Yeah, no, and thank you, Sue. I think that's right. As we're looking at like one piece of what's envisioned as a whole document, and I really value folks coming into this, looking at it, and giving it that sort of outside feedback. I think it's helpful. Subcommittee members, Iris has also added some, like a different version. Sorry, Iris, I know you sent this to me earlier today and I didn't catch it, but a different version of sort of what she presented here, which I'll sort of cut and paste in here so we don't lose it. I think is great. So we'll consider adding those or incorporating them if people want to look at them. Other sort of initial reactions or thoughts from folks?
Sarah, I wonder if you could repeat what your vision for next steps are, so that, I think for me anyway, it's hard to read off this document. I know we've sent stuff back and forth, but what do you, in my mind, we're getting sort of close to a draft that incorporates a lot of feedback, and maybe the job of the next week is to put all of these pieces and then send something out for our hopefully maybe even final reflection next week. I don't know if that's too fast, but I'm thinking that this isn't the only time, right, that we'll speak on this.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's helpful to get some general feedback from the group. But yeah, I think for next steps on this portion of it, if there's one or two people who want to come together and refine this, because I think while we're doing a lot of additive work, we're not necessarily doing the work of refining it to be more clear and concise, and to still keep in those general themes, but achieve the goals of, making it easier to understand. So I think that's an important step, and so I'm wondering if that's a next step, is that we do that. We could certainly bring it back to the group as part of a final draft version of a document, but it will look different than what's right in front of us right now. And hopefully we could share something Tuesday so that people have a chance to read it in advance of Thursday's meeting, and we could be finalizing it then. That's what I'm thinking is the next step on this piece of it. And I certainly, if people want to empower me and say, no, Sarah, you go do it by yourself, that's great, but I was feeling a little bit lonely out on that. Iris is saying she's happy to sit down and meet with me. We can find a time and hash it out. That'd be great.
Sarah, there's hands from Chris and Amanda. So Chris, if you want to go ahead.
I couldn't see while I was sharing, so I'm going to stop sharing. Amanda.
Thank you. This is just in relation to the document you just had up in Iris's edition. I feel like that bullet point about getting away from the status quo seems like a really powerful statement to maybe put at the top of the document, like guiding principle number 1, get away from status quo. So that's just a quick suggestion I have.
I'm thinking, yeah, this is still, it's a draft. We've worked on it for a while, and really appreciate Sarah and everybody who's been pulling this together. I'm feeling like we need to get this draft out to the other subcommittees as soon as we can. I know that they're waiting for this. I'm just wondering if we could, if it's possible to move up our timeline even without the refinement, so that way, I don't know, I think it would be helpful to, I'm wondering if it'd be helpful to get some feedback before we even do the refinement. Just to, because I'm frankly a little, not concerned is the wrong word, but wondering to what extent we're going to need to bring along everybody to even understand what a lot of the principles are and why they're there. Because we've been talking as a group about this for a while, and I think we've kind of brought each other along. I guess what I'm thinking is I'm wondering how much more work do we need to put into this draft before we solicit input from the larger council and subcommittees and then bring it back again. Not trying to screw anything up. I'm just.
Thanks, Chris. No, I think that's a point well taken, and maybe it's a great segue into these other sections of our meeting tonight, right? Because this is only one piece of what we're preparing to bring to those groups. I just want to say personally, when I step away from this document, as we have added to it, and I think there's such beauty in there, I find it less and less accessible. And that is really concerning to me, even for other subcommittee members. And so I just really, I feel personally committed to trying leaning into that part of the work this week. But if others aren't there with me, like, I can back down and say, okay, we can refine it later. I just feel like that feels like an important piece where I'm sitting. So.
Okay. I would second that, Sarah. I think that the work that you're doing is really speaking to a need to take these rich and complex issues and make them so that they're not only accessible to other subcommittees, but also other audiences and stakeholders that will be taking in this information, implementing it, and really, establishing an ethos of everything that we do within the plan. So I feel you.
Yeah. All right, so I will work with Iris to find a time where we can do some of that work. And I want to transition now to the next part of our agenda, because Chris, I'm assuming your hand is from before, not a new hand. And that's okay. I'm so bad at the hand raising thing. And go to Amanda. I think, Amanda, you were going to share and talk about the impacted and frontline communities. You were trying to bring together the next version of that. Thank you.
Yeah, my job was very easy compared to what Sarah's been doing. I basically just synthesized what we were talking about in last week's meeting in relation to the page that David had shared, his first version of frontline impacted communities, and I incorporated comments that people had made, and also just joined that with some documents that Nadia had put together. So really, it's just one big document. So let me share this with you. Can everyone see that? So this is the list, and these were kind of on the right is the overlapping areas, and my thought was that people will fall into each different categories, and how can we provide this list to other subcommittees so that they can functionally use this. And I guess if we just want to look at it, and I'm happy to make changes right now as we speak if there's anything you see that's popping out as either being redundant or people you feel that have been missed, or maybe we should make the list smaller just to make it more digestible. Or maybe we can subclassify them more. Yes, Iris.
I like it. I was just wondering, just when we're bringing this to other subcommittees, like maybe a format that would just better encompass and show intersectionality, just because these aren't, each of these categories isn't mutually exclusive. And yeah, I just want to make sure that's kind of reflected in the format that we present them.
How do you see that looking? How do you see that looking like? Or how do other people see that looking like?
I don't actually know. So maybe we can think on that, and we can, as Chris was saying, I do think it's important that we get these out soon. So I think that maybe if we just put that at the top, just saying, like, making sure that everyone who's reading this understands that these are categories that are not mutually exclusive, that would be fine with me, just as long as we're coming to that understanding.
I'll make a note to change that. All right. One other thing I wanted to mention or ask the subcommittee if they thought that this was part of the work was including geographical communities that have already been, or geographical areas that have already been identified. And I had pulled some communities that the Rejoice group had identified, and I'm not sure if we want to include some communities like this, communities that have already been identified through their research of having disproportionate environmental vulnerabilities. I think this is somehow useful to incorporate as well, in terms of like the rubber hitting the road. So any thoughts
Amanda?
on this? Yeah.
Amanda, can I say something?
Yes.
You know, in looking at this, I wondered why Indigenous communities is like 2 or 3 down from the top. In Indigenous communities, you know, we were here before anybody else was here. You know, this is our land, and we always get pushed to the bottom. We always get lumped in with everyone else. And I think that there are a lot of Indigenous people that would look at that and say, oh, okay, you know, they're doing it to us again. Certainly, new Americans and immigrants are important, but Indigenous communities should come before that.
I agree, Beverly. That's a great point. Judy?
I also have a question about where are Black people, because when you look at the definition of BIPOC, it stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, and people of color refers to Asian, Pacific Americans, and others.
Mm-hmm.
So Black should be specifically listed, because under the BIPOC definition, they don't fit.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just clarify that we would also want to include Black and people of color?
Correct.
And I will say for myself that in a decade past, that term, people of color, was thought to be inclusive of Black, but I respect and understand that thinking is evolving. So I'm glad that you're making this point. I just want to make sure I was right in saying that we should have Black and people. Yeah, good.
Yes.
I appreciate that comment, Beverly.
Right, as we go, Amanda, you're doing a good.
So I also have a question where the circle says people who are at risk of losing their jobs. What about people at risk of losing their land? Because some people are already losing. Several people I know in a Native community have already lost acres.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to go to the town with them to fight because they were paying taxes on 2 acres of land that were underwater.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I think I had alluded to this a little in this flood comment or here, but I think that's a relevant. Let me just get a little piece of paper since it's hard to toggle between screens. I want to incorporate these comments, but not.
Yeah, I think I just want to ask Judy, do you believe that, as I think you might understand from this kind of way this is screened, we have sort of an overarching categories, frankly, on the right, and then more specific on the left. Do you feel like that would belong in the right column? We could even incorporate it right into the one, people at risk of losing their jobs and or their land.
Right, that's where I would put it, yeah.
And then I also wouldn't want to just suggest on the left-hand side, Amanda, that it's only low-income people living in floodways. They are the most at risk, but I think many, that's not an income-specific challenge.
No.
They're just impacted people.
Yeah.
I will mention that bottom circle that's a little covered up now is people most exposed to climate risks. And that was explicitly thinking about risks such as flooding or people losing their lands to being underwater. And that was the intent of that bottom circle. So, I mean, these things all do overlap, but that's what that one's about.
Yeah, maybe that could be just summarized as people at risk of losing their land or experiencing major geographic, or I don't know, how should that be worded?
Why don't we leave it as is for now? But I think I appreciate, David, that is inclusive of that. But I do think knowing right now people's land is already underwater or in flood hazard. But it could be combined. Thanks.
Sorry, I can't raise. I'm so bad at this, but Amanda, I'm thinking. I'm just reminding myself of the idea of this framework as we have the circle. What you've done is circles, which I think is really nice, is to say these kind of are overarching questions to understand what we mean by what kinds of communities are impacted or frontline communities. And then on the left, we're like naming a whole lot of specific communities to be. And so I think that's helpful, and it's hard because it gets a little mushy, but I do still really like this way of doing that. And somebody made the comment, and you asked, Amanda, so I just wanted to also name, like, I also like pulling out the specific geographic areas in Vermont that Rejoice has named in their work. I think it's worth doing that to, rather than other people have to go find that information to incorporate.
Yeah, and I was questioning if that maybe is something that more like would be more functional for the public engagement consultants, like thinking about like these are the communities that we really want to talk to. So maybe that's where that more information is more relevant.
Could I ask a question about, you have rural locations, but yet some of the places on your list of impacted places are city, like Burlington.
Yeah. I was thinking about that as well, Judy, because my family all lives in really rural places, and they're like, oh, Vermont policy is always towards people in Chittenden County. And I was pondering these communities because they're all like Vermont's micro cities. And I was thinking that those were the communities that arose just because of the population disparities and how that can skew data. If, there's 24,000 people and 8,000 of those people fall within these categories. So that was kind of how I thought that those cities came about.
I want to Rejoice specifically had some data that they were using to come up with that list?
I believe
yes,
so.
That's right. They did some mapping around historical environmental health burdens related to environmental justice, and those were the communities. So, you know, maybe they have a map that we could use or something that would illustrate that. We could think about.
I personally feel like I'm not sure I want to go to the geographic region because I think it brings up a lot of important issues that Judy has raised. And I think we're trying to get, instead of geographic communities, I think we were trying to list the kind of what we called the frontline communities. And I think that if in fact these geographic communities are identified based on risk assessment, and I've seen risk assessments that really aren't looking at high hazard flood risk as we now think of it, and I don't see them incorporated here. So I would personally rather we just think of, you know, those so-called the list and not get into the geographic, because I think it risks really leaving out some important things, and it takes us in a different direction than I think we're trying to get narrower or less rather than broad. But that's my opinion. Sorry, I'll be quiet now.
No, I agree with you because I'm thinking of Brandon. Brandon originally was called Nashabee, and it literally translates in Abenaki to full of water. And so they're often full of water and they're not appearing on any list.
Yeah.
And I think it would be problematic to say some, and then other communities will say, well, what about mine?
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
The town of Jamaica got wiped out from Irene, and there are many, many smaller communities that were really devastated by Irene that really aren't represented there. So I think it's problematic.
Noticed Kelly has patiently had her hand up. I wonder if you want to say something, Kelly?
I was going to call on her. Kelly.
Thank you. This actually segues from what was just said as well. Thinking about this list that we're looking at now, this first page, I think we should make a point of saying that this is not exhaustive, and also that these are not listed in any particular order, not to imply that, you know, oh, if you're way down on the list, you know, I'm like, oh, I'm a small business owner, I'm way down on the list, I'm not important. That's not, that's not the intention here, is that this is, that, yeah. So I think that we probably want to make a point of that so people don't feel left out or pushed down to what Beverly was saying earlier.
Nadia? Thank you, Kelly.
Before I go, I know that Virginia and Iris have comments that they made in the chat box, if you guys would like to jump in before.
Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't seen those.
Yes, I was wondering if you can specify. I know that immigrant englobes a wide range of individuals. I was just wondering if you can specify the undocumented on the list.
Thank you, Virginie. That's a good consideration.
Thank you.
Because they're at more risk.
Iris, before I say anything, did you want to comment on your feedback? Or?
I'll say, you can go ahead. Thank you.
To Judy's original point on the designation of Indigenous communities and African Americans or Blacks, is there, I guess the question is to her, but also to all people of color on this list, could we, in this committee, could we include the first bullet as Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Because I'm concerned that when we start to enumerate specific not classes, but specific communities of people, that we run the risk of, you know, me as a Latina and as an Asian saying, where am I in this? And that's exactly what we're trying not to do. So perhaps putting it in one bullet, wherein it is differing back to the BIPOC reference, that we avoid that risk. And Judy, again, would love your feedback, and others on the committee as well.
It was actually Beverly that brought that up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Beverly.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
So do I. But in the definition, people of color is supposed to include Latina. So but clearly everybody doesn't know the definition. So spelling it out, like you're saying, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't see Asian people as people of color. And, you know, I know that we have a lot of Vietnamese and Hmong people in Chittenden County also. And they would be considered people of color as well as immigrants.
I'm so sorry, my computer froze, so I missed most of that conversation.
We were just discussing whether or not we should combine the first 3 bullets into one and instead just calling it, you know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to avoid the risk of feeling as though we're naming specific cultural groups and avoiding others.
So should, is the consensus that we should type out BIPOC at the top? Though I will say, to Beverly's point about, my opinion is that Indigenous people communities were here first. So I think that does seem like an important point to me to consider. But just my opinion.
Yeah, I do find, you know, I understand the terminology BIPOC, but somehow I always feel like Indigenous people get lost in that BIPOC. Most people look at BIPOC and think Black.
So I think it's a really healthy conversation for us to be engaging in how to present this, and with a spirit towards wanting it to name specific groups. We want to have people consider, I think, as I'm reading some of the chat boxes, and also provide a framework, and also make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible as this group intends. So maybe we can, Nadia, I'm not sure where you're landing on that. We can think about, you know, spelling out people of color more specifically rather than just using that sort of catch-all term. That might be one approach as well. And so I want to sort of help us move forward in our meeting tonight, because we are running time, because of course we tried to pack a lot into this meeting. There's probably some additional feedback on this as people are processing it. There's some good comments in the chat box. What does it feel like are the next steps on this document? Does it feel like maybe Amanda and someone else working with Amanda, or people can give Amanda final feedback? We can sort of look at a next version of this, bring it back as part of a final draft package. The next step, Amanda, how comfortable are you continuing to sort of shepherd this document forward?
Yeah, I'm comfortable, but certainly because I represent the majority, someone that is representative of the non-majority would be help. I saw Virginie, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of supporting the idea to keep both on the list.
Both what? I'm sorry.
People of color, Black people, indigenous communities.
Yeah. What if I spelt out, I guess this just becomes challenging. I was thinking I could spell out Latinx, Asian communities. Does that sound appropriate? Or something we could take up in a smaller sub-working group, all these little conversations, to Sarah's point about moving forward.
Is there another word for immigrants? Because to Indigenous people, anybody who's not Indigenous is an immigrant.
Is there a suggestion? I mean, I think it's a point well taken. Did you have a specific suggestion, or just kind of naming it as something to think
No,
about?
I was just asking, is there another word? I don't know of one. I mean, if immigrant works for everybody, it's fine, but I just wondered if there was another word.
The phrase "new Americans" is often used that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, but there's some old Americans too. Yeah.
I'll make a note here, and let's convene in the chat about working with this document some more. I'd be happy to collaborate with anyone or receive feedback.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, and maybe the co-chairs tomorrow, when we pull together, we can think about sort of how we get this document over the finish line. But great point. People can keep using the chat, playing with language, and it's great feedback. Kelly, I see you had your hand up. I'm sorry. I don't know if that's a new hand.
Can I actually make one more comment that came to mind in regards to this document, and something we've been talking about in the subcommittee is lifting up those first who have historically been marginalized. And I would say, to the point of naming Indigenous people first, I mean, it seems like, per our discussions, a good community to put at the top of the list intentionally. So another kind of argument for that. That's all. I'll stop talking.
Okay. So I'm going to pause. We try to take some public comment sort of partway through the meeting. So I just want to pause and create some space for that before we move on to questions for assessment evaluation. Public comment, folks can feel free to raise their hands and I can call on you.
Hi, Sarah, I'm not sure how to raise my hand.
That's fine, Pat. I'm glad you just unmuted. Go for it.
Okay, thank you. I just wondered if Judy's slides will get posted as part of, and maybe they're somewhere else and I missed them, but I feel like she has really captured the rock at the heart of all this that most people aren't used to talking about. And thank you, Judy. I so appreciate how you conveyed the information you were conveying. And the other thing, and I'll think about it and I might send something to Amanda, but when I was reading through the list of frontline communities, it's, well, I belong in this group and I belong in this group and I belong in this group. And I don't know, in terms of allocation of resources to address certain actions, certain recommendations, if we look at the cumulative, that folks that are affected by a number of things, it's not clear to me yet how to do this, but there needs to be some way of conveying how many people actually belong in several of those groups. To what point, I'm not sure, because it's not clear to me sort of what the recommendations look like. But anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Yes, and I think Jane put a comment that it is posted online, but we'll make sure it gets linked specifically in with our minutes and agenda so that people can have that easy access. And thanks. I think there are two important points kind of outstanding out there, is how we make sure we illustrate sort of the intersectionality piece, and then we understand this idea that because folks are part of multiple communities, and some communities are cumulative effects of being impacted by some of these policies. I haven't really quite captured how to pull that in, but that did come up last. I didn't articulate that very well, but that did come up last meeting as well, if people remember. And we haven't quite figured out how to incorporate that. But Other public comments? Okay, carrying on. There was a team that did get together this week to start to brainstorm some questions, and they used the Jamboard, and I think David is going to try to help us move forward that part of the conversation. So David, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Super, thanks. And just as a quick reminder, because this has been our mantra tonight, but reminder, like what we're doing here, this package that we're trying to offer right away, right? There's a piece of the draft principles that we looked at earlier. There's a piece of a definition of frontline impacted communities that we just looked at. And there's a piece about how you translate this into the questions we want the subcommittees to be asking themselves in this formative process of reviewing old policy and looking at potential new policy. Right, so these are the three pieces. There's also an introductory piece that Sue and others made reference to that's not on my 3 dots here, but these are the components of a package that hopefully we can get in the hands of other subcommittees as soon as possible. Okay, so I just wanted to remind folks, so let's talk a little bit about the specific questions piece. And as Sarah mentioned, some work was done on this in a sort of brainstormy way of naming a bunch of things. Let me drop the link in the chat so people have access to this. This link is that everybody can edit it link, so just be kind in editing and don't try not to erase things by accents or anything. We don't have necessarily the time tonight to spend a lot of time refining per se, but we can do a couple things tonight with this. One is we can all get our heads around what makes for a good question in the sense of what are we really trying to have happen in the subcommittee level. So I would like to have a conversation about that a little bit. And then also recognize that there's different types or layers or altitudes of questions. And so we can help tease things apart. And afterwards, a team, just like a team's gonna have to work on that principles document, is gonna have to work on the impact of frontline communities definitions. There's gonna be a team that really turns this piece that's just more brainstorming and seems like a lot of text and ideas and consolidates it down into these different levels of questions. Questions that are very high level and saying, have you considered broadly this idea? And then questions that are quite specific based around these principles that are listed at the top of the Jamboard that are evolving, right? Because you all are making changes to those principles right now as we speak. Okay, so where I'd like to start is sort of making sure we're all on the same page of the purpose of doing these questions. And I'd be interested for the folks who are working on this earlier this week, if you could just say a little bit about what was in your minds when you were formulating these questions and how you saw their application. So I know in that group was Claire and some other folks as well. And so I'd be interested to hear from you all. Where was your head in terms of sort of the intention behind putting these questions down in writing?
I can start. I think that's a good question that we all probably came with slightly different perspectives with and talked about quite a bit after we brainstormed, because there was one like very practical approach, which I think Amanda had taken and I had taken a similar perspective, was actually just reading the principles and then basically trying to translate them into questions that would sort of help folks almost interpret them or make them more sort of personable to the work they were doing. And then I feel like, at least this was what I got from some of the other questions that were written, there was sort of a higher level sort of like gut check almost of like, how do we want these principles to be helping folks rethink the way that they're doing the work. At least that was my personal perspective. I would welcome others who are participating to also add.
That's helpful, Claire. Others that were doing this work, when you thought about the why behind it, like what's going on, why is it important to do this? Don't be shy. Okay. So I'll say, Claire, the way you describe, oh, go ahead. Someone just jumping in.
It was Jane, but I was hoping Nadia, but I think Nadia might have hopped off. But Nadia oriented us to some thinking that I really appreciated at the beginning of the exercise around sort of tiers of questions, like a set of overarching questions, and then bringing it down to different levels of specificity to translate into action. And so, recognizing that the principles are really high level, hard to like translate into like how you review a specific policy or strategy that comes out of a subcommittee. And so Nadia was really trying to ground us in these different tiers, which I really appreciated. And then I really liked the idea of thinking of the questions as implementable, like action items for the other subcommittees to apply to more easily to their thought process than perhaps the principles will be.
Right. Yeah. Right. It feels very related to the work they're being asked to do in their subcommittee. Yeah. Okay.
And I'll just add, actually, I think they were on here, but Nadia had also provided us with sort of a list of active words to help sort of guide the way we were framing these so that I think they would be actionable. I think that was at one point a sticky note on here. It's not there anymore. I think it was deleted after the brainstorming, but I felt that was also really helpful to the extent we keep developing those. We could get her to share that back with the group.
Do you remember what those words were, or some of them, Claire?
I might. It was sort of like words around like making space for, or actively reforming, or actually, while we talk, I'll try and find them in my notes and paste them in the chat.
Okay. All right. So that's the intent behind here, right? And for those of you that sit on other subcommittees, really, that's the lens to use, is like, can you see the subcommittees taking this question and weaving it into their process, right? Or these questions. So that's one thing. The next thing is, are the questions that you most would want subcommittees to look at somewhere on this document right now, right? Is there something in your mind when you say, oh, I really want rural resilience to think about this aspect related to equity and justice? Is it here somewhere, right? So that's going to take a little bit of time to read through, but it also takes some thinking on your part. Like, what do I really want these subcommittees to be asking themselves? So I thought we'd just take a minute and for each of you, first to say, what would I most want subcommittees to be asking themselves? You can pick one that you're particularly interested in, whether it's the cross-sector mitigation or rural resilience or the ag and ecosystems, or even the science and data, right? Think about what you most want them to be asking themselves on justice and equity issues, and then take a look across this screen and see if you see it. And so I think it'd be interesting. Oh, thanks for those nice active words. I think it's interesting, folks, just to take a pause and to read for a little bit, and then feel free to throw up another, drop another sticky on this board. I'm happy to share. Anybody having a hard time seeing it from the link, I'm happy to share my screen with it. Would anybody appreciate if I shared my screen with this board as well?
I would, David. Can you share that? That would be
You
great.
bet. Is that easier to see? Can you see that? It may be a little small in the Zoom window is the problem. Okay. So what I'd like each of us to do is to just do a read through for a moment. Think about what your real priority question is. and see if you can find it there. And if it's not, drop it in. Let's just take 5 minutes or so and read, or 3 to 5. I'll give you a heads up when we're close.
Say that one more time, David, sorry.
Think about the questions or question that you really, really would like other subcommittees to be asking themselves on the issues that we care about, our principles, right? And then read through these and see if you see it. And if you don't see it, write it down. Kashka, you were able to read this closely, or is it too small?
No, I'm okay. I just kind of made it. I have it at full screen, and okay. I'm pretty close to my screen.
Yeah, your nose is like up on your screen. Yeah. Virginia, I need help with the acronym SDOH. I'm sorry. Thank you. Okay, let's just take another minute or so. I've been taking what people put in the chat and throwing it on the board just so it's all collected in one place. Okay. So this has a lot of great questions on it. It has also the challenge that Sarah has mentioned in the principles document, that it needs another round to become accessible, right? It needs to move from the stickies to something coherent, which probably means consolidating some of these questions or creating some order or doing that tiered work that Jane mentioned, or Claire, about questions that are very high level and then the more specificity. So I think there's a next step of going from like, here's all of our good ideas to here's some easily communicated way of saying really big picture questions you need to keep in mind, some specific questions that are relevant to specific principles or ideas that we have around impact our frontline communities. So Claire, do you want to be a point person again for taking that next step with this?
Yes, I can be point. I am partially out of the office next week, so I would appreciate some support if we want to have like really advance this by next week, but I'm happy to help coordinate and help with the work as possible.
Great. Okay. Does anybody want to raise their hand and say, yeah, I want to take this great collection of sticky notes and help turn it into a set of organized questions that we can transmit? Does anybody want to help on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to help again in that group or a different group, whoever ends up being there.
Great.
I'll be happy to support.
Thanks. Amanda? Okay. All right. So that's another piece of work that needs to happen and then get pulled back. Let's see if we can get it done by Tuesday. We will do our very best to get it done by Tuesday, to turn this into something that feels like something a subcommittee could take and make sense of. Okay. Any final reflections when people read through this? Anything that people want to say about their experience about trying to work their way through all these questions? Like, how did it feel to read all this stuff? Sue?
I think it's a lot and a little overwhelming, and I am suffering with a day-long headache, so that could be part of it. But I do really want to encourage somehow a synthesis, which is an impossible task. But that's how I felt, a little overwhelmed. But I will say the more I spent time with it, I did have some questions in my mind and I felt like I found them. So that felt really good. And yeah, I think it's going to take time for our subcommittees to digest the work we've been doing, which is deep.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Other reflections people had, Kashka?
I think I would second that with Sue. It's definitely, it's just a lot for, to try to get something going, something that is going to impact, every community, every person and non-human. It's just a lot. We're putting something together for them that is, I hope, is not prohibitive in some sense, but it is just thought-provoking. And I have hope that we can do this, or that they can do it with our guidance. It's just a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet. Sarah?
David, yeah, I'm struck by the fact that some of these questions are yes or no questions, and some of them require a more narrative response. And so I just, in thinking about Claire and the group that's going to try and synthesize these, I wonder which and maybe that's fine. Again, it's just a draft version and we can come back. I think the intention is still to come back later and kind of refine these questions to support subcommittees in looking at in some final decision making around policies and principles, and it's just enough to kind of help guide them at this moment in time. But you know, for me, it sort of begs, do we want to go towards a yes, no, or where people are rating things, or are we just asking them questions that they're supposed to be thinking about along the way? And that might be where we're at for this, just asking them questions to think about along the way. At some point, if we're asking people to actually assess a specific recommendation and like say that we did an equity assessment on, it just feels like it needs to be a little tighter. So again, I think maybe it's fine for where we are now, but I just wanted to name for me that I'm looking at it that way.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sorry, just to jump in based on like the brainstorming session, I think we felt a lot of that, and we went through and refined a lot of the questions and combined some and ended up leaving a wide range of the detail, like high level versus detailed, in part because we weren't sure where we should fall with these. So to the extent folks have really strong opinions about that, that would really, I think, be really helpful as we move this forward.
Great. Abby Willard?
Yeah, thanks. So again, this just made me think about the State of Vermont Equity Impact Assessment Tool as a similar model. And I think to Sarah's question, it comes back to what's the intent of asking the other groups to consider these questions? Do we want them to provide answers that then goes through some sort of an evaluation that they are meeting expectations of being equitable and just, or is it just to bring awareness to them of concepts and considerations that they maybe didn't otherwise have in their recommendation development? And I think that goes to whether we want an actual narrative response so that we're sort of determining that we are reducing disparities, that we are offering equitable representation, or are we really just asking them to kind of add these additional considerations into their decision making? And I don't know the answer to that, but maybe we need to answer that before we can do the next step.
Yeah. I will say that the way this has been envisioned is at this stage for the subcommittees, that what you're really trying to do is influence their creative process and how they're thinking. And that in a later stage, when you have some draft ideas on the table, to do a somewhat more formal assessment process and have a somewhat more formal assessment tool. And so while that may be an unnecessary split of like what's needed now versus what's needed later, I think it may be helpful in helping all of you get something out the door sooner to be part of this initial process with the subcommittees, is you don't need to view this as a formal assessment tool yet. This is more a set of ideas and guiding questions to force some critical thinking in this initial phase, these initial phases in the subcommittees. Is that helpful? Judy, do you have a comment?
Yes, for me, this is something I've thought all my life about. We have lived in a world where everything seemed unlimited. So it's kind of like the harbor, right? And we're going through the narrows into open waters, into a world that's uncharted. And nobody will know what it's like. But some people will make it through the narrows, other people will not. And so the question that I keep asking myself is, will somebody who can afford to buy their way through the narrows help pick up those who can't get into this new world? And when we get there, what are we going to take with us to be prepared for this change in the new world? And so all those little stickies for me bring up that narrative of how are we going to get through the narrows? Who's going to be there to pick up those who cannot make it? And what are we going to bring through the narrows to help us when we get to the other side? I'm sorry, I kind of live in metaphors, but.
Metaphors are great. Metaphors are really helpful. Okay. Are there other comments on this before we turn it back over to a smaller team, Claire, and Claire can let everybody know the timing of when folks are going to meet. So it's an open, whoever wants to be part of it is welcome to be part of it.
I'll just say,
as long as you don't have a quorum.
we've been doing a little back and forth. Tomorrow from 1 to 2, Amanda, Liz, and I are all free. So if anyone would like to participate then, that's our first meeting. And then I think we'll go from there. And if we want to meet again, we'll definitely make that available. But if you're free then and would like to contribute, let us know.
Great. Okay. So let's leave it there. I know on our agenda, or your agenda, you wanted to do some report backs from subcommittees. Sarah, do you want to try to do that real quick?
Yeah, right, thanks. Thanks, dude. Handing it back over. I feel like it's a little like mic sharing today. I think we've got like maybe 2 or 3 minutes and then we need to pause for public comment again. But folks who have been at other subcommittees or steering committees in the past week, are there, we did have this co-chairs meeting, right, where co-chairs all heard from the other subcommittees, but are there other things that, you know, maybe Nadia didn't mention that you want to raise up just for the full subcommittee awareness? So how about data, I can remember the names of the subcommittees, data committee?
Science and data, yeah.
Yeah, science and data, thanks.
Danielle's not here, so I can just say quickly that Science and Data is still working on developing their work plan. And Danielle and I did reach out to the co-chairs of this committee for input on that. And then I'll leave that to the co-chairs to determine how best to solicit feedback or input. But otherwise, just starting to dig into one of their primary tasks, which is the greenhouse gas inventory methodology. I think that's it, unless Jane has anything to add.
How about cross-sector? Oh, Jane, did you want to add?
I was just going to comment that for folks' awareness that Science and Data is shifting to an every other week meeting and going longer. And so just wanted to highlight that in case folks are interested in participating. They're not meeting again now for 2 Wednesdays.
Cross-sector mitigation. Anything else lift up from there?
Chris, do you have anything to add? Chris was there today.
Just one of the things, one of the reasons I'd be glad when we get these principles out is I think it will help, well, as Sarah was saying, just help frame kind of things to think about. I think we're also going to need to help provide some assistance in how to think through some of these principles and apply them. There was a discussion about, understandably so, but you know, in the public presentation or in the public engagement discussion, sorry, my battery is winding down for the day.
Everybody's
in the public engagement discussion, there was a question, that legitimate question about, you know, how are you going to kind of set the context to even have the public engagement? You know, are you going to present, you know, what the council's work is, why, that kind of thing. But one of the things that came up was about, you know, the importance of framing that, and, you know, it should be data-based and yada, yada, yada. And one of the points I was trying to bring up from this committee was, you know, part of the point of this is not to go in and tell communities, tell people what they should believe, what the situation is, but rather to ask them to share their experience, engage with the data, ask questions of the people who can, you know, interpret, understand where the data came from, that kind of thing. So that way, I used my, you know, coal mine community example of, it doesn't do much good to go into a community and say, you're losing jobs, you're seeing more flooding, therefore you should be interested in you know, carbon-free economy. Instead, ask the questions of what's your experience with job loss in your communities? Are you seeing changes in the industry? Are you experiencing more flooding? And then present like the data and have them ask questions about it and arrive at their own opinions. The only reason I brought that up was it was just, you know, there's this tendency to just kind of present, here are the facts, this is the way things are, and this is why we have to change. And I think that, and I'm sure that's going to be the case among most committees. It's the way most of us function in the world. and so we may need to really focus on some training about what all this stuff really means and how it really works beyond just the public engagement, even just the framing of the policy recommendations and implementation strategies. Does all that make sense? Maybe. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful. Thank you. We're coming up on time. Rural resilience, was there anything you wanted to lift up before I shift to public comment? I'm going to do that one more time.
Wait, I do, sorry, I do, because it is so important to your work. With the last week's meeting, we spent diving into, one core topic was diving into the vulnerability indices. And next Friday, not tomorrow, but next week, we'll be joined by the chair of Maine's resiliency work group, as well as a number of other, Green Mountain Power and Leslie Ann, also to talk about the climate assessment. So different tools that are both in the state that assess and look at vulnerability, as well as consider our A&R Deputy Secretary will join us to talk with us about the work that's happening within the Agency of Natural Resource around vulnerability mapping and how that relates to the vulnerability indices. So that just might be a meeting of interest to folks here if they want to sit in on.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, we're at time, but in the spirit of honoring public comment, we did have some earlier. I'll just offer, I think that you're still with us if you wanted to offer any additional thoughts.
I think the one thing, to go back to David's question, like when we look at that list, what's missing, and maybe it's there, but I didn't see it, and that is around sort of these hard stops in terms of the world's finite resources. So the fair share issues, which I included with the questions that I submitted, and if we aren't going to talk about that, then it's sort of, the rest of it really becomes meaningless. And I'm really rooting for you guys that you have the courage to put that forward, because a lot of people aren't going to want to hear it. That's not who we are culturally as privileged white people, that there's a finite amount of anything. And so I'd be happy to help in any way I can with that conversation. But thanks again for the time.
And I will say, just so you know, we did share your questions. Thank you for doing that thinking. We did share that with Claire and her team so they could have that when they did their work together, and with the group. We'll make sure that everyone sees those. Thanks, Pat.
Or I'm sorry, Pat, I'll just say quickly, thank you so much for the comments you submitted. We did not incorporate those last week, but we will take those up tomorrow. And there was a lot of really great content. So thank you for that.
I think if I know nothing else about this group, it's that we've been pretty courageous, and we want to keep being courageous in our work. So so thank you for encouraging us, Pat. We need encouragement. All right, so I'm going to call it a meeting, you guys. Man, 6 o'clock on a Thursday. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody. Have a good night.
Take care, everybody.
Have a good night.
Thank you, Sarah. Bye-bye.